Okay, thank you everybody for coming. I think we're going to have a great conversation here with Steve. First of all, before we begin, just to get a sense of the audience, how many people in the room are entrepreneurs or founders? Oh, good. Good representation. Okay, great. How many are investors? Okay, great. And how many work like for a large company? Any large company folks? A couple, a few? Okay. Sounds great. Okay, so that is terrific. So we have about 40 minutes together. And just as a way of introduction, Steve has come all the way from the Bay Area to be here today. However, he is a bit of an honorary Canadian. His parents are both Canadian, and he used to come up here a lot when he was growing up. So welcome back. And I know he has some family in the audience from the Toronto area. So welcome, Steve family. So Steve announced earlier this year that he had raised a $200 million fund, Future Ventures. And I know that Future Ventures invests in disruptive technologies, so focuses on early stage investments in companies in the space exploration, quantum computing, robotics, synthetic biology, and other similar areas. So great areas which we're going to have a great discussion and fits in with the topic of Elevate being moonshots. Prior to launching Future Ventures, Steve was an early investor and is actually still on the board of companies such as Tesla, SpaceX, and D-Wave. And prior to that, he was a co-founder at DFJ, where he invested in companies such as Hotmail, Skype, and Planet. So again, terrific to have you here. We're going to talk about three different areas today. First, we'll talk about technology trends and industry shifts and get Steve's perspective on that. Secondly, a bit of a discussion on, hey, what is it like being an investor in moonshot companies? And then thirdly, what are some of the traits of successful moonshot company founders, and maybe a few stories of successful and maybe unsuccessful founders that he's seen. So Steve, would love to start off and talk about, what areas are you most interested in investing in right now?
Sure. And is this working? Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Janet. So the most important thing that jumps to mind is the sheer diversity. Like, if you'd asked me that question in the 90s, or any venture capitalist, they would have said something like, well, there's this internet happening, or before that, semiconductors, or computers, or networking, right? And it would be a single thing. An entire career would be built around that. And in fact, in the 90s, when I started in venture capital, there was software, there was computing / networking, and life sciences. And that was it. I mean, if you invested outside those areas, you could, but you'd lose all your money. Like the automotive sector was a dead zone for 90 years and so forth. And so it never occurred to me in the 90s that the answer to your question today would be, oh my gosh, it's like, I couldn't even tell you 5 years from now what sectors will open up, and it feels like every industry is becoming ripe for disruption. So one way to answer your question is I've always invested in things that are unlike anything I've seen before, yet adjacent to prior areas of investment experience. So it's not a random walk, it's sort of an outer frontier expanding, if you will. And so, and we can get into these, but this has had me excited about synthetic meat as a subset of agriculture, about in the category of space, new constellations of satellites that make broadband data soon imminent, and obviously exploring Mars, and we're in the Mars building, seems apropos, and taking moonshots. I mean, it's literally our logo to take moonshots. Quantum computing we can talk about out of D-Wave. It's basically one example, and there are many others, of building specialized computers to take Moore's law to the next generation. So you have quantum computing as one branch. Analog computing, strangely, is having a resurgence, or at least I believe it will, specifically for machine learning, and other dedicated normal chips for machine learning and deep learning. I'm also super excited about things that had been rolling, if you will, over the last few years, but now finally the rest of the world would agree it's a moonshot underway, like all vehicles becoming electric, all vehicles becoming autonomous, like within 50 years, 100% of them, there will be no gas-burning cars, and at least no new ones for sure in 50 years. These are pretty heady industries. I mean, talk about agriculture, aerospace, automotive, soon construction, fintech. Every industry is being revolutionized by software, and that's exciting because it changes forever, and it makes new entrants have a chance and makes products the better for all of us.
Absolutely. Now, question for you. How do you assess whether a market is ready for a new technology or for a new moonshot? I mean, we talked earlier on the phone about how timing is everything. And especially when you're going in at the early stage, how do you think about figuring out, is this the right time?
No, it's a great question. And the place where I've made the biggest mistakes as an investor has been when I've been too early. When I've seen, oh my gosh, like I can make these bold statements 50 years out. Yeah, that's great. But how about like, is that going to be a dead zone for the next 5 or 10 years and then towards the latter half of the next 50 years? So the question hits home. Just again, to reiterate the mistakes, in the early 2000s, 2000 to 2006, I made a number of mistakes in what was called nanotechnology, where I saw the potential of something that maybe today is just now starting to hit and come to market. In fact, I've been on the board of a few companies for over 15 years because it took that long to sort of hit their stride. And I can see now in retrospect why, just in general, if you are re-engineering something from the atomic scale up, it's going to take a while to propagate up to the point where you have a product or service someone cares about. It's probably not the most relevant business-wise right now today, but I can understand in retrospect how I got enamored with science projects that here's the key lesson, didn't engage with customers with a real product for the first 5 years or so. And that was the death knell. And so instead, today, even though they have this bold star on the horizon, like take SpaceX is easy to understand, colonizing Mars, that's why everyone joined the company. That's kind of crazy. Right? That doesn't happen within 10 years. That doesn't happen within 15 years under anyone's forecast. But that doesn't mean they hunker down, do nothing, obviously. The whole point is you have the star on the horizon, the big bold mission, and you iterate with customers along the way. So we would not have invested in SpaceX if they didn't have a NASA contract for commercial cargo. The initial customer of substance for SpaceX was just bringing stuff to the space station. Substantial amount of revenue, even made them profitable on that piece of business alone. That made all the difference, right? That's like night and day. And by analogous form, like with Tesla, it was coming out with a simple roadster, which the initial roadster by no means was going to take the world by storm in terms of being a product for everyone, but it sort of created enough momentum, enough credibility to then raise some additional capital to bring out the Model S, right? So this two-step thing, bold dream, iterating with customers along the way, and believing that first iteration and learning loop will start within the first 5 years, ideally sooner.
Right. And as you're going along the process, and I think this is something that all entrepreneurs think about is, hey, when do we keep going down the same road, and when do we pivot? And as you think about your Moonshot companies, I'm curious, you mentioned, hey, you got to find some customers. Like, how have you advised your companies if they're going along and not finding those customers, and when is it, hey, it's just a matter of, keep going, and when it's no, actually, we got to pivot, this thing isn't working?
That's a great question. So there's some companies, and I would encourage you to think about, in the early days being one of those companies that are nimble enough to at least have the opportunity to pivot.
Yes.
Not that you should, it shouldn't be necessarily a goal, but in the internet domain, for example, software and services companies generally can do this more easily. There'll be some major element, or sometimes the entire product conceptualization that can change when you have a smart group of coders together, and in a weekend binge of a hackathon, you can even cobble together a straw man of some new product direction. And so just as a quick sort of interesting data point, in the 90s, we invested at DFJ in internet companies more than any other venture firm in 95 through 96, literally more than any other firm. We did 30% of all internet investing in 1995, which is kind of crazy. Wow. In retrospect. That's how little there was back then, frankly, that one firm could even have a claim like that. And so we accumulated, a pretty big portfolio through the 90s. About 80% of everything we did was internet. And the only reason I say that is to say we had a large number, scores of internet companies, so enough data to maybe make an interesting statement. And I look back, and 2/3 of them changed their name. As an interesting checkbox of a change of direction. A bold example, JavaSoft Inc. changed to Hotmail. They originally were a flat file database tools company to be sold to developers. And they're like, crap, this really is a crappy business. What can we use our tool to build? Well, let's make free web-based email as a marketing stunt and run with that. And so forth. There are even more bold examples of pivots. In the deep tech, disruptive, like sort of, if you're building a nuclear fusion reactor, well, actually, I take that back. I know of a nuclear fusion company that literally thought they were doing great on building a nuclear fusion reactor, and this is not in our portfolio, but I got pretty close to this company, and then they realized there was a calibration error in their measurement equipment, and they weren't doing nearly as well as they thought they were, and they immediately came to this horrible realization one weekend that this isn't going to work on the trajectory we're on. Pivoted like that to make rocket thrusters, Hall effect thrusters, which is a different kind of plasma physics, and now they're designed into a bunch of satellites and doing just fine. So even I was about to say it rarely happens in our industry. It may just be that there's less. I don't yet have as many data points as I did in the internet. But to your question, how do you know when to do it? Well, there's usually like, in the deep tech, it's like, oh shit, this isn't gonna work. Like sometimes if you're honest with yourself as a scientist and engineer, you realize that you've hit some fundamental barrier. I love one of Elon Musk's quotes, which he has used often, sadly, and when looking at certain companies out there, to say, success has to be one of the possible outcomes. Right, and you have to let that one sink in, because there are a number of companies out there where success is not one of the, when you look at the fundamental physics of what they're trying to do, it's like, there's just no way. There's just no way certain companies are pursuing are gonna work. And when you have that honest realization, it's time to pivot, like the Fusion company did. Often I won't be the first to see that. I instead invest in people who have that sort of intellectual honesty, the enough self-confidence to be humble, to admit when something's not going right. They aren't just, let's say, the worst is a salesperson. Someone who's like so endemically in sales mode that they don't have the capacity to admit, you know, I'm just not succeeding here, right? Whereas sometimes, and many of you probably know these people, the best engineers are the first to come up with, well, you know, that experiment just failed. Yep, straight up failure, didn't work. Let's do something different. Right. So listening to the engineers, yes, ignoring the salespeople, getting rid of the salespeople, and moving on to where you think an adjacent opportunity lies is often the best thing to do. Because just like I said earlier, I'm surfing the adjacencies of a technology wave. Yes. If you're at the cutting edge of something, be it AI, synthetic meat, you name it, and the thing you've got isn't quite right, almost by definition, you're adjacent to something that's really exciting. Maybe you don't want to make synthetic meat. Maybe you want to make the feedstock that other people will feed to their cells. You know, there's a whole ecosystem of opportunity around this new synthetic meat movement that even if your particular branch doesn't bloom, jump to a different branch.
Great, okay. You know, would love to sort of shift and talk about some specific deep technologies that you're interested in. And one, you know, to start with is quantum computing. And I think that's particularly interesting because Canada is one of the leaders in quantum computing. And you were an early investor in D-Wave, which, as many of you probably know, is a Vancouver-based company. And would love to hear about, you know, your views on quantum computing, what made you interested in that company, and where you see it going.
Sure. Yeah, I might emphasize something you just said in case it was lost in the audience or if you're not in this domain. Canada is the world leader in quantum computing, bar none, and I would argue the world leader in the new renaissance in deep learning over the last 7 years. Really, it was something I studied back in the 80s. It really wasn't going anywhere. Luckily, I moved on. And it's having a massive resurgence out of Hinton's lab at University of Toronto, Yasho Bengio at Montreal, and a bunch of others. Basically, it's here in Toronto, first of all, and Montreal secondarily. The world leader in AI and quantum computing. It's just like we should pause and recognize that. But to your question on quantum computing, so there are a variety of software companies here in the Toronto area, Xanadu and a bunch of others, and then in Vancouver, over on the West Coast, you have the world's leader, meaning over the last 10 years sold more quantum computers than anyone else. The first company to sell quantum computers, the largest quantum computers, the most useful quantum computers, you name it. Like any metric you can think of, they're far and away number one, and you can't name who number two is. You might say it's Google. You know, some people deep in the industry might say that, especially in the last week or so, they've announced some pretty good results on a different branch of quantum computing. Now, why do we even mention this? Why, like we wouldn't be up here talking about supercomputing or high performance computing or, you know, back in the day, a Cray or silicon graphics machine. Like those really are not interesting, right? If you think about, you know, 50 years from now, history books will not be written about Cray, SGI, Sun. I mean, yeah, there might be chapters in books, but no one's going to remember those companies, and they really won't have made a dent in the universe. They were just one of the myriad of companies that had proprietary architectures and Moore's Law, along the march of Moore's Law. Quantum computing is fundamentally different from everything else. There is an argument that they literally this month have crossed these curves, sort of the pace of quantum computing's progress and Moore's Law as we know it, where once it crosses, there's no going back. Like, it's not like Intel catches up or computing catches up. And maybe to give a provocative statement as to how different it is, among the only physicists who try to explain quantum computing are folks like David Deutsch and others out of Oxford. There's two camps. Those who don't try to explain it, they're like, I don't get it, I don't understand it, I don't want to talk about it. And then those who try to explain it. And the ones who try to explain it basically evoke the concept of parallel universes. Like literally harnessing the refractive echoes across parallel universes to do a single computation. That's when your head usually explodes and you're like, I can't compete in just this universe. I need a few more universes at my side. And it then leads to conclusions like you should be able to have computers that fit on this stage, cost less than $10 million, that could compute things that could never be solved by classical computers. Things like really complex protein folding problems, optimization problems akin to the traveling salesman problem, things that are are really difficult, computationally intractable, and we just assume we have to have heuristics to work around them, that these computers can just slice right through as if it was butter. In the most extreme case, David Deutsch points out that in theory, these computers, and ones that we might build in the next 5 or 10 years, could outcompute the entire universe of material, meaning if you took every atom of the universe and reconstituted it into the perfect computer we could ever design, they still couldn't solve problems that these quantum computers could solve. It's like wow. And so that's really exciting in scientific computing, in areas like advancing genomics, I guess, protein design, synthetic protein design, and simple things like route optimization for Amazon and everyone else driving trucks and planes around the world, and all the robo-taxis of the near future.
Great. Another area that I'd love to touch on is synthetic meat. Yeah. I know that this is something that you're focused on, and I would love to hear what are your thoughts on it. And again, getting back to that point around, hey, how do you know when it's ready to its tipping point? Would love your thoughts in terms of why do you think that we are, as a society, are ready to adopt and move full scale into synthetic meat?
Yes. So two parts.
Okay.
To your question that I want to make sure I don't miss. One would be, why now technology? Like, can we actually make it cost effective? And second, would people eat it?
Yes.
So the old dog food test, as they say, not really the best metaphor to use when referring to human food. But there are some going after pet food, actually. It's the first market. Like, one way to get around the ick factor is make it for pets, right? They don't know what they're eating. So, oh boy, I wish I hadn't said that. That's the wrong marketing message. Okay, I'm someone who said I'm looking for synthetic meat investment 7 years ago. That's obviously not a great term for it. The industry's settled on clean meat, I think, to start, because it begs the question, what's the alternative? But let me start with the same framework I mentioned earlier. 50 years from now. Sometimes when you look out 50 years, things become a lot more clear than if you try to look out 5 years. I think so, especially in these areas. And 50 years from now, I cannot fathom that we would, at least in Canada and the US, slaughter an animal for meat. Because in 50 years, we'll have seen how much easier it is. 10 times less land, 10 times less water, 10 times less cost. By the way, no systemic risk for swine fever, avian flu, mad cow disease, things that if you're a meat buyer like Cargill or Tyson, you are terrified about the systemic risk across your whole supply chain from some of these infectious agents and outbreaks.
Not to mention, right? I understand that cows actually are a huge contributor to the greenhouse effect.
Absolutely. Arguably neck and neck with oil and gas in aggregate in the short term because of methane production. Largely burps, secondarily farts, but both. And it's a big deal. There's a shit ton of these animals on the planet. About 40% of usable land on planet Earth, actually I take it back, in America is for animal production, 33% roughly globally. I mean, literally, the crops that are just grown to feed the animals themselves, it's a third of all usable land on Earth. And there's no way we can keep up with China's growing demand for meat, because whenever the lower castes become middle class, meat consumption explodes. When it did in the United States in the 80s, we basically decimated the Amazon basin. Ever since 1980, the single largest contributor, over 90% of all deforestation in the Amazon basin, is for US meat production. It's called American grade beef from South America. China's about to do that to Africa. And it's just unfathomable, but we're not going to go there because, in fact, what has changed is we can see a better way, and it's in prototype stages now. But let me describe it briefly. And also to your question on like how did I get a sense for now's the time? I actually started 7 years ago. I did a blog post saying this seems like the inevitable future. Here's why. I'm looking for a company that can show a scalable manufacturing method. Because 7 years ago, there were some early companies that were using 3D printers because they came from the medical industry, and they realized they could, and they had printed a bladder that was in a kid I met. This 18-year-old kid had a bladder that was 3D printed. Others were working on kidneys. Very slow, very personalized, one-to-one. Here's your kidney. So 3D printing is not out of the question, but not metric tons of beef and poultry and things that need to cost $1 a pound at the limit. So I didn't see a solution 7 years ago. I knew this was an inevitable future. I did not see a single company that I could find that had a path to get there. On the way there have been the plant-based substitutes, Beyond Meat and Impossible, which have a whole different market segment in a way, and a lot of money and a lot of engineering effort for each and every substitute product, but not one catch-all for everything. Whereas if you can grow cells, the way Memphis Meats and other companies are showing, you can do all species, if you will, all types of meat like that. You want chicken, you want fish, you name it, pork, duck, even extinct animals, which is an interesting thought experiment, you could make into a meat product. And what you're making is exactly the same as what you're used to consuming. So it is a steak cutlet. It is a chicken cutlet. It is not a plant substitute. It is a piece of meat. It is the same cells harvested from that animal. So you basically, here's what you do. Take the stem cells, immortalize them, have them growing in one vat in perpetuity, just like we do in medical research. which is where the founders came from. Then you differentiate them skeletal muscle, because at the end of the day, all you want is a bicep, let's say. Like that thing you got right here. You don't want your bone, you don't want any brain, you don't want any GI tract, methane, all that other stuff, right? You just want muscle. So you can do that. You can differentiate cells just to be muscle, and you harvest that and you make it as thick as you want. So you can eventually do better things, 20-centimeter thick steaks, steaks that have omega-3 rich oils like a salmon, but taste just like a steak. You can do blends, turducken, whatever you might want, just as easily as anything else. So just like a wine blender can make a better tasting wine, you could have meat blends that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but basically look like a steak and taste like a steak, but better than anything that Wagyu or any other method has produced. Oh, and could be healthy too. That comes later. Early on, for customer adoption is the biggest risk, and you had asked about that. Early on, the strategy is just make it exactly the same. Don't screw around with marketing improvements, no differences. It's the same, it tastes the same, it cooks the same, it is the same. Walks like a duck, talks like a duck.
Yeah.
Is it a duck? Yeah.
That's the hope.
So,
Wow.
I mean, the meat industry is going to, and they are freaking out, trying every dastardly deed they can, regulate. Say, I mean, they're ready, trying to pass laws that say you can't call it meat, of course.
Yes.
They literally are trying to say you must slaughter an animal to be meat, because there's a lot of gray areas around what they do too. And certainly they will try to spread misinformation. So we'll see. But so
Great.
far, so good.
Perfect. Okay. Moving on to the second sort of topic that I said we would cover is would love to get your thoughts as an investor in Moonshot companies. What sort of things do you think about as an investor? And as an investor in Moonshot companies, we've already covered some of this, but are there any things that you think about, hey, would you have to have a different approach versus traditional companies?
It's a new question. So when I was forming a new firm for the first time, because it's been a long time, I actually joined what was called Draper Associates, and they call me a founder, but then they changed the name to Draper Fisher Jurvetson, but I wasn't the first person there. And I know what it feels like to be the first person there, when it was Tim Draper just for the first 7 years, just himself. So I really wasn't, the only reason I'm saying this, I really wasn't a founder even though I had the title. So when I started Future Ventures, It was myself and Mariana Senko, who I'd worked with at DFJ, and I think is the most capable investor I've ever met in my career. She's just amazing and is exactly like me, but different in many ways as well. But we invest in the same way, the same sector. So we want to focus on this thing that I'd been doing as a weird, one-of-a-kind, wild, what's the word, Lone Ranger maybe, or outlier within my firm, to being a firm entirely focused on this. So we thought, well, what is different? So one thing is that we went for a 15-year fund instead of a 10-year fund. Every venture fund is trying to get everything wrapped up, and we all, the DFJ, we always ran over to 15 years. We actually kept extending the fund, but all of our LPs, when they signed up initially, thought they were in a 10-year vehicle.
Yes.
It's just the small print said, oh yeah, we keep extending it up to 15 years, no problem. And we have to every time. So here we were more communicating up front. Look, moonshots take longer. Not because the revenue doesn't start at the same time. Like year 5, these companies might be making hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, like SpaceX and some others. But it doesn't mean you're exiting that early. You can see this in SpaceX, right? Their future is still ahead of them. All the broadband satellite revenue, all the commercial space and tourism, all of the colonizing of Mars. Who knows how big that'll be? But the company's just starting to hit its stride after it's had multiple years of billion-dollar revenues and profitability. So it's just like Tesla. A lot of the growth isn't in the first 5 years. It's just the beginning. Maybe here's another way of phrasing it. It may sound bold and crazy, but if you're trying to build trillion-dollar companies, you go through billions on the way. You go through 100 millions on the way. It's just you don't want to be punching out when you're at hundreds of millions. Okay. So that's one. From a selection process, here's what I try to do. I try to, as I mentioned, invest in things that are unlike anything I've seen before. I think the reason that's so important is you avoid overcrowded categories. As an early stage investor with a $200 million fund, I can't be a kingmaker with capital. I can't do what Masayoshi Son is doing, where you're driving a pink Cadillac down the street, throwing bags of money left and right? That's like a whole different investment strategy when you have $100 billion funds. That's just mind-boggling, right? Unprecedented. And there's always been a company like that. Before it was DST, an order of magnitude smaller, and so forth, who would write checks that are about 10x bigger than anyone else is writing, and really disrupting the market. So that's not us. So because of that, I can't be in a sector that has tens of companies. So, for example, in space right now, there's all kinds of investor interest. 310 venture funds, the fact that there's this many of them, have invested in space companies. And the vast majority, 70% of that capital, has been within the last 4 years. In fact, in 2015 alone, more venture money went into space companies than all prior years combined times 2. And there were space companies in the 80s and 90s, and it's so this is insane. And what has that led to? 131 small sat launch companies, for example, all going after the exact same niche that maybe is big enough for one, maybe two companies, one in the US and Canada, one in China. And that's it, done. Like there should be no more. And we're talking about multiple unicorns, multiple hundreds of millions of dollars going into several of these companies, and it's like sometimes I feel like I have a sixth sense. I can see dead people, like, and they just don't realize it. Like they're all dead, except for maybe one or two who will have a niche. So my point is, overfunding is so easily in this sector. Like let's say disruptive technology. So what is the lesson from that one? Be early, but not often. Meaning, in other words, we did SpaceX, we did Planet Labs, we stopped. We haven't done a single space investment since because it's just like too many. Like. It was the simple filter. Have I seen? Yep, I've seen a few of those. Yeah, I've seen 4 or 5 of those. Yep, seen 10 of those. Like autonomous driving, 80 different LiDAR companies just building LiDARs for autonomous cars. Over 500 different autonomous car startups copying the Tesla lead or just wanting to build some new niche. Over 500. Wow. So I'm not doing any of those. Yes. And so I have to find something new that's kind of weirdly different, off the beaten track. It'll be something that we wouldn't want to talk about today because no one would agree it's a sector yet. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Going on to the traits of successful founders, you have, throughout your career, you have worked with so many different successful founders, and also, I'm sure, some that weren't so successful.
More of those.
Yeah. What are some of the traits of the most successful founders that you see?
Yeah, and I think this generalizes across both the internet time in the 90s and the because I want to try to share things that are more relevant to everyone as opposed to, well, only if you're a space entrepreneur would you care about that. So I think some of the universals are first, having enough self-confidence to be humble, which is kind of an unusual concatenation if you think about it. But this notion of knowing what you do well, both as a guide to who you need to hire to complement your team, as well as having honest conversations with your investors and others about what really needs to get solved to move forward. So, for example, the entrepreneur who pivoted from that fusion to Hall Effect thruster company is one of those awesome entrepreneurs. We had backed him 3 times prior at DFJ. He's just one startup after another, and he really knows how to build teams and motivate them, which maybe leads to my number 2, which is having this infectious enthusiasm that gets people excited about what you're doing. I can't tell you how obvious it is in person and impossible to tell by email, by the way.
Yes.
When someone, and you probably know this too,
yes.
Like, why do we still have in-person meetings? Because it does not matter what they put on paper. You can tell in the first 5 or 10 minutes if someone has you hopping up out of your seat with enthusiasm. And for me, over the years, this has been for things like municipal waste system treatment plants. I mean, things that if you looked at the category, you'd say, that sounds mighty boring. You know, reinsurance for certain subsectors of whatever. I mean, things that I'd looked at over the years that maybe my partners dragged me in to, meetings I might not have normally have ever stepped foot in. I'm like, my God, this is exciting. And a great entrepreneur can do that. Like, there's a reason why they're doing this. There's a reason they think this is going to change the world for the better. And it sometimes starts with pretty prosaic beginnings. Metaphorically, you know, just selling books on the internet for Amazon. But he had a dream that was much bigger. Just shipping DVDs in the mail. I remember this one because I turned it down, Netflix. But there's a dream of how it's going to, the name, Netflix, was kind of a clue, right? We're not CD Flix, we're Netflix, or DVD Flix.
Yeah.
Anyway, that ability to do that means they'll recruit the best and the brightest to join them and so forth. And so that maybe naturally leads me to my third. Having some kind of mission. I often ask entrepreneurs, okay, what does your company look like in 20 years? Sometimes they'll even say longer if they look like they have a long-term view. Something that I believe is longer than any business plan they've ever put together. And if they are totally like deer in the headlights, or worse, I've actually had people laugh at me at the absurdity of the question. Like, what do you mean, what does my business look like in 20 years? I'll have punched out so many times over. Like, I'll be my 3rd startup by then. I don't really need to hear anymore. Like, if they don't have a dream of what they look like in 20 years, they're not thinking about building a business that's going to scale, right? None of the companies I've been involved with that are successful are done at the 20-year point. And the ones that are these built-to-flip companies like consumer electronics, which is a horrible investment category. I think it's the worst of all things that VCs put money into. It's low-price hardware for consumers. None of those companies have over 30-year value creation, or at least in the last 30 years, there hasn't been a single one that you wish you would have invested in. That would be RIM and all of them, right? They're flash-in-the-pan companies by design. They have to be. Anyway, I digress. Back to the kind of companies I do like to invest in. They are like, yes, in 20 years, here's what we're doing. We'll finally be able to colonize Mars, or we'll have led the industry to come off of gas cars and shift to electric. And here's how we'll move out of just cars to cars, trucks, airplanes, what have you, and expand the vision. There's something that's motivating the founding team that's not just arbitrage-seeking opportunism, like, or make a quick buck. The whole point is to get rich, isn't it? No. times get tough. I've seen Elon stick through thick and thin at Tesla and things that are just beyond heroic. And you don't find entrepreneurs that do that if they're doing it for making money. And by the way, if you don't have a mission, your employees also are continuously debating about prioritization. Like, what should I do this quarter to maximize profits versus this year versus this century? The answers are going to be different. And in public and private companies, when you don't have a clear mission, everyone's squabbling, and the larger teams don't act with any coherency because they don't know what they're striving towards. And one person can make a very good argument about taking some short-term shortcut to make short-term money that's anathema to someone else who's thinking long-term. And the whole thing falls apart. So stepping back, one last conclusion statement on this. I think small companies run circles around large companies because they have small teams. 5 to 7 people is the maximum size to make decisions as a team. Anything bigger, you're not a team. You got to have subcommittees. Boards of directors that have more than 7, they're not a team at that size. They have subcommittees that get stuff done, including large charity boards. Venture firms, totally counterproductive when you have more than 7 people on your team. It just dramatically plummets. I saw that at DFJ. Our best times when we had small teams, our worst times when we had big teams. Startups naturally have small teams, but you scale. You got to grow. The only way to continue to have some semblance of coherence when the small team is overrun by hundreds of other people is that everyone knows what you're striving to. You don't have to be in every meeting to remind them, does this help us colonize Mars or not, right? And so forth. So anyway, and having a mission, I think, is the only way to scale.
That's great.
Yep.
Now, we're just about out of time, so one last question I'll ask you
Sure.
is, for all the entrepreneurs in the room, do you have, I mean, you've given so many words of wisdom and advice, but do you have any closing thought or advice that you would like to leave for all the entrepreneurs in the room who are building great companies?
I haven't, but something jumps to mind that I think is important. Often you'll face a lot of naysayers in the early days, folks who don't believe in what you're doing. If you're conceptualizing a new business and you share it with 10 of your friends and they all think it's brilliant, it's probably not that interesting. It's probably obvious. And you might do it, but that's probably not going to be the kind of company I'd want to talk to. And it may or may not be appropriate for venture capital. It may just be a good small business. I mean, like every local dry cleaner would fit this bill, or any, the 99.9% of all startups that are local businesses. But if everyone but a couple people says it's crazy, right? Like 8 out of 10 say you're nuts, that'll never work, here's why. And 1 or 2 people think it is the most brilliant thing they've ever heard of, that is the formula for success. And you should run with it. Now, do keep open the possibility it is just stark raving crazy. So if all 10 out of 10 think it's stark raving crazy, try to find someone. Please find someone who agrees with you. Maybe they'll be your co-founder. And this, by the way, I think is why the best companies always have a dynamic duo, 2 people that start the company who are very different from one another, like Jobs and Wozniak as a mental model. But if you dig under the covers, almost every tech success, there's someone, usually an introvert you don't know about, and the extrovert, who have mutual respect for each other and scale an organization from their differences. It's not like the cult of personality of one CEO and everyone else is like that CEO. It's 2 very different people that then build a cognitively diverse team that can scale. So that's the other thing that relates to find someone who agrees with you if you're on a fool's errand.
Right. Well, listen, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And great conversation. Thank you.